when it comes to coronavirus. So cases now worldwide topping 2.2 million. Now we also here in the US, those number of cases are continuing to climb. And that number now totaling 662,000. There is, though, a little glimmer of hope as we've seen the number of cases rise. A drug from Gilead is showing some effectiveness in treating coronavirus. So for more on this, I want to bring in Dr. Vivek Murthy, a former US Surgeon General under President Obama, and also author of the book Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. And Dr. Murthy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. Let's just start this off, just getting your insight into what's been happening with the coronavirus. What do you think of the country's response to the outbreak so far?
Well, I think that what's really promising is what people are doing in terms of staying home, because we are seeing now that is having an effect. It's tamping down what was going to be an extraordinarily high peak of infections in the country. And we're starting to see that in some states, like California, that the wave has not been as bad as we had worried that it would be. In New York, we're starting to see a plateauing of new cases. So there's progress being made. But we've got to be really cautious here, because the United States is not all progressing at the same timescale when it comes to this infection. So just like we're seeing plateauing in New York, we're also seeing other areas start to take off. In Boston, in Philadelphia, in the DC metro area, in Florida, we're seeing that the situation is actually still getting worse. So we've got to be cautious. And we're still, unfortunately, struggling with the response side of this. We unfortunately were a bit late to recognize how bad this was as a country. We have been late also when it comes to ramping up testing, which we desperately need. And we're also still having trouble getting the materials, particularly the protective equipment that healthcare providers need. And, we've been making some progress over the last month, but it's unfortunately nowhere near where it needs to be if we want to feel safe in relaxing the social distancing restrictions.
Yeah, Dr. Murthy, what do we need to do in order to get more testing, in order to make sure that we have the medical protection that's necessary in hospitals across the nation?
Yeah, so this is one of those times where I think what we need is a very focused and directed effort to dramatically ramp up three things with testing. One is the number of tests we have available. Right now, we're doing, around, actually a little less than 150,000 tests a day. That number needs to be closer to 1 million tests a day. We also need to ensure that there's adequate distribution of the tests so that people can get them everywhere in the country. And third, we've got to make sure that the turnaround time is fast with these tests. Waiting 3, 4, 5 days for a result, which is what's happening to many people still as of today, just means that we have people who are getting delayed diagnoses, and we're burning through protective equipment in hospitals as we keep people, under quarantine while we wait for their results. So what we really need, I think, both with testing and when it comes to the protective equipment, is we do need the federal government to be more aggressive in stepping in and taking over the supply, the production, as well as the distribution piece of this. We do need a wartime production board, like what we saw during World War II, to ensure that we're coordinating all levers in this country to respond to this unprecedented pandemic, but that we're also doing so in a way that's accountable and that's delivering results. We haven't quite seen that yet. I'm optimistic that we can get there. But in pandemics like this, what I've learned being a part of these kind of pandemics in the past is that time equals lives saved. And the longer we delay on hitting our targets, on pulling out the stops and getting there, that means more people will suffer and more lives will be lost. And we can't afford that.
So, Dr. Murthy, taking all of that into account, do you think it's way too early for the administration to be talking about the phases? They laid out 3 phases to reopen the economy last night. Do you think we're too early to really be having that discussion at this point?
Well, I think it's actually a good time to be talking about the plans, because people need to know as early as possible what we're looking out for, and so they can understand whether we're ready or not. I do think it's premature to say that we'll be ready by May 1 to open up, because keep in mind, what the administration's plan is calling for is a very important signal. They want to know that the number of new cases are going down for a sustained and significant time before places start to open up. But the way we know that is if we test adequately. And if we know that we're still struggling with testing, if we recognize that testing is like our eyes, and now we can't see properly because we don't have enough of it, it doesn't give you a great deal of confidence that the numbers we're seeing actually represent the trajectory of infection in this country. That's why you hear public health experts harping so much on the testing piece. If we want to open up quickly, if we want to support and to restart the economy, if we want people to be safe, most importantly, the best way for us to do that is to ramp up the testing as quickly as possible. That's why that's so central. And the plans that we see and what the administration unveiled yesterday, while in principle, I think they're the right direction to be moving in, there's not enough specificity, and there's also no real plan there to help us figure out how we're going to close a massive gap that we're facing right now when it comes to testing.
Right. And going off the lack of detail, because I think a lot of the critics were pointing to that ever since the plans were laid out last night. But when we talk about having three different phases, and of course, that brings up the question as to what if you are living in New Jersey, but work in New York or vice versa, and the states are in a different degree of the phases? How do you protect the residents of each state? Because it's almost impossible to keep people from traveling across those state lines.
Well, that's exactly right. And so it's an artificial construct to say that we can just section the country off and say, okay, this region is okay, everyone open up. And the region right next door, everyone stay indoors. Because we know that there is a flow of people across state lines and county lines. And if we want to start getting back to work, people commute into work often from other states. These are some of the details that we need to think through deeply. As I've talked to governors and to state officials, they've been asking these questions about when they're going to get guidance about travel in particular. When they open up, should they be cutting off travel from other places, or should they be putting in extra, precautionary measures like checking people's temperature when they arrive in their state or across county lines? These are complicated questions, and to leave it up to states and counties to figure this all out on their own is highly problematic, because what you saw in the first part of this response in the United States was that because of a lack of direction from the federal authorities, states moved at varying paces when it came to putting in stay-at-home restrictions. And if you look at the studies, what they tell us is that if we had moved even a week earlier in terms of putting these restrictions in place, we would have saved or reduced the number of peak deaths potentially by as much as up to 60%. If we had moved 2 weeks earlier, that reduction could have been up to 90%. So this is why time is of the essence. And in an ideal world where we would spend months, deliberating and letting people make their own decisions in states, federal leadership is critical in moments like this. You've got to act boldly, courageously, and quickly. And I'm really hoping that we can get to there on the back half of this response.
Dr. Murthy, what do you think about the progress that we're seeing on the treatment front? We got some positive news out from Gilead that one of their drugs could potentially be effective in treating coronavirus. How hopeful do you think we should be about that at this point?
Well, I'll tell you, what gives me hope is the fact that we've got some of the best scientists in the world all working together on finding therapeutics, whether it's studying remdesivir or looking at other potential therapeutics. I think the news that we received recently about remdesivir, I would take with caution, because number one, this was information that was leaked from an internal discussion. This is not a completed trial that's giving us adequate information both about efficacy as well as about safety. And we need to understand both sides if we really want to understand, but this is something that's ready for prime time and something that doctors should be prescribing everywhere. So look, I think we should be, I'm hopeful that some of the drugs that we are testing, that at least one of them will be found to work. But I think it's premature to assume that remdesivir is a silver bullet that we've been looking for.
And Dr. Murthy, quickly, what about vaccines? Because in the best case scenario, we're still, 12 to 18 months out from having a vaccine for coronavirus. Without that vaccine, do you think the U.S. could be facing a new normal or a new, normalized way of life until that point?
Yeah, the vaccine is really what we need in order to return back to normal, to pre-COVID-19 levels of activity. Until then, we'll likely need to be under some form of restrictions in terms of our social activity. So in the early stages, for example, we likely will not be able to see large crowds gather, whether that's for sporting events or for concerts. It'll be still too dangerous because remember, this is a virus that's highly contagious, as well as one that is much more deadly than the flu. So we'll likely see restrictions like that, as well as precautions like wearing masks in public that will likely need to become part of how we live our lives until we have something like the vaccine, modifying how we greet each other, avoiding handshakes and moving toward non-contact greetings. We'll likely need to continue that for a while. So there will be a new normal. And this is not easy. Having talked to many people around the country about this in the last, few months, the last few weeks in particular. I know that this is placing an extraordinary amount of stress on people as they're trying to deal not only with these changes, but also with the uncertainty of how long it's going to last. So we're all hopeful that a vaccine will come onto the scene quickly, because that will be the game changer that will allow us to get immunity in a wide portion of the population and then get back to our way of life prior to this pandemic.
Dr. Vivek Murthy, former U.S. Surgeon General under President Obama and author of the book, Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. Thanks again for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.